than just fitness and wellness, but basically the healthcare system. For two reasons. Number one is, there's a lot of chronic illness. We've seen major upticks in, diabetes, hypertension, all these kind of problems, obesity, and how can we use technology to basically make people's lives better? Most of the clinicians believe that it can be done. There are some issues around behavior change and these kind of things, but I think it's the innovative startups that will not only detect interesting things about the human body using wearables, but then trying to figure out how do we change people's behavior, and then how do we connect the dots to the healthcare system, because frankly, that's where the money's at. It's measured in trillions of dollars that is spent on various illnesses in the U.S. and not all of it, but some of it at least, which is probably measured in at least a couple of trillion, is directly related to chronic diseases, which is, I call it follow the money. How can you create an interesting wearable startup that does something which somebody else will pay for?
So, if we continue to focus on the healthcare, for wearables, do you think the industry is preparing for the patients who are more technology savvy, who are going to be your patients in the future, 10, 12 years, 15 years from now? Because the current crop of customers are very little technology savvy. So I'll give you an example of a product that I saw about the contact lens and having the measuring system within the contact. Then it's tied to through cloud to the doctor, and then the patient also have that. Now, most of these people who are now in the 60s and 70s are not that savvy in terms of having their own measurings done. So do you think instead of spending time to educate the consumer, we're actually targeting somebody who's in the 40s and 50s now and will be 60, 70 in the next decade or so, and that is where you're building the
this is actually an interesting topic. I was talking to a physician actually just yesterday who told me he's been pleasantly surprised. Now granted, this is not a wearable, but it's a technology device. He's been kind of amazed at how many of his he's a cardiothoracic surgeon, okay, and he's amazed at how many of his older patients are using tablets. He was stunned. Now, a couple of years ago, the data showed that yes, there doesn't seem to be anything going on with the older patients, or let's call them end users, when it comes to technology. So I think it's perhaps as simple as this. If you deliver value and you account for things such as clearly people that as humans age, we have problems with our eyes and we can't see little tiny dials. Well, maybe somebody creates a screen that rapidly enhances the font size. There's a simple solution. All of a sudden, maybe people that have challenges with their eyesight will use that device. Why do they use tablets and not smartphones? Because the tablet has more screen size. The doctor said he's amazed at how much they love to pinch and zoom and these kind of things. So I think you can't discount huge swaths of the population because of some aspect about them where the technology can address that.
Carrying this conversation further, there's also the cost factor. If you look at the countries like US, huge amounts of problems with insurances. So that one factor is the cost will substantially be lower.
Yeah.
The second aspect, if you look at the developing world, the access to medication and to health is very limited, if any. So then, because of remote capabilities, you can do that.
Yeah.
So there's a big playing field here. So the question I'm trying to understand from you is, the companies and the technology, they have a two or multi-pronged strategy to reach out to these potential consumers.
Access is an issue not only in the U.S. but, like you said, around the world. But if we look at, it's baby steps, right? So if you think about mobile phones in parts of, say, Africa, well, it's true that smartphone penetration is pretty limited. But guess what? turns out banking, for example, is done much more on mobile phones than even in some parts of the US. Why is that? Because they're using the basics. They're starting with the basics first, which is simple text messaging. I read something about Kenya, for example, where everybody does banking on a phone. Well, compared to the US, that makes the US look backwards. Now, are they using smartphones? No, they're using basic phones or feature phones. But that's very interesting. So can we learn anything from that and think about, well, baby steps? Can we start with delivering some kind of basic apps on basic phones? And I'm calling it apps very loosely. It may not be some sophisticated app like we're seeing here or in Asia or in Europe, but can we think about access that way? So, simple example. If somebody has a very cheap, and somebody on the panel mentioned Xiaomi has a $13 wearable device. Well, let's assume for a second that it's giving very accurate readings, heart rate, activity, these kind of things. You don't necessarily need a fancy smartphone to interact with that data. What if that data in a more healthcare challenged country goes directly to the local provider through maybe even, I don't, a 2G signal, because it's not going to be bandwidth heavy. And now the clinician has long-term data on somebody's heart rate, and let's say they're a cardiac or a cardiology patient. And let's say their heart rate is not controlled because they haven't been taking their drugs. I'm not a physician, this is a very simple example, but theoretically you don't need a fancy high-end smartphone with a big display and huge computing power to do this. You need a basic wearable device with basic heart rate technology communicating through a basic 2G network to somebody's PC, and let's just assume for a second that at least the clinicians in that country, the physicians and nurses, have access to computers. Start with what you have and then move up as the country moves along with it. I think that's an interesting question. Where should the startups focus within healthcare? I think it's for the startups to figure out, right? So part of the challenge for all startups, whether they're in healthcare or elsewhere, and this is no surprise, everybody knows this, is what's your target market and what's your business model? I think because we're so early on in wearables meeting the world of healthcare, for the most part up until this time, and it'll probably continue for at least another year or two, the main focus has been wellness, fitness, these kind of things, which is great. But again, follow the money. Big money is spent in healthcare. Where does it make sense to intersect healthcare and try to monetize that to become a viable startup? I don't think it's the world of call it the subspecialties like oncology and things where the mortality rate is much higher, because the big problem we have is chronic illnesses. Hypertension, diabetes, atherosclerosis, which is related to high cholesterol, which is related to things like back to fitness and wellness. Can you move the needle on the number of dollars spent on these over time very expensive chronic illnesses? Where in there can you move the needle? How are you going to move the needle? Those are the areas where I think the startups can make a big impact in as little as 1 to 3 years. If they're really good teams, they can really start to figure this out. And we're starting to see some startups really kind of think about this, but there's been no huge breakout success yet because, look, if this was easy, everybody'd be making $1 billion off their startup. It's not easy, but given the strengths in technology, devices, Moore's law, right? So devices have more compute and they can do more interesting things, and devices are shrinking, MEMS technology, what have you. We're able to collect more and more interesting things about the human body. Right now, we're literally just seeing the tip of the iceberg. It's the basics, the heart rate, the activity, all this kind of stuff. But it's going to get better. We're going to be able to, some startup will solve the blood pressure problem. Some startup will solve the glucose problem, which is related to pre-diabetes, which is related to diabetes, which, guess what? Huge chronic illness problem. Not only, by the way, not only in the U.S., but around the world. India, huge diabetic problem. Even China, huge diabetic problem. The startups that focus on these kind of problems, which are global in nature and extremely expensive. And by the way, let's never forget the end user. In this case, we'll call them the patient, he or she. There's a lot of morbidity associated with these diseases, particularly diabetes. You know, things can get very bad if people don't manage their insulin levels. Before they even get there, but when they're pre-diabetics, let's try to address, for example, that'd be my number one category, pre-diabetes. Let's address people before they get diabetic. Let's help them to stay in pre-diabetes forever and never move, you know, unfortunately, up chain into the world of true illness. If you can help health plans and employers and individuals figure that out, you can have a viable startup and I think make some money in this business. So my favorite wearable right now is a Samsung product, but it has not, it's an investigational device, a prototype reference design which is modular. It's called Simband. And of course, you know, I'm probably a little biased, but I'll tell you exactly why I think it's interesting, because it's modular in nature. It does have the basic capabilities, heart rate, you know, activity, but it also has more advanced ones like ECG. But here's what's interesting about it. It is up to the startups of the world to come out with the modular components that can go into the device to deliver other things about the body. And I would predict that sometime in the future, I don't know when, some very interesting partner of Samsung, which probably is going to be a startup, will come out with the really interesting biometric component or the hardware component that will detect something that we're not seeing today about the human body that is in a consumer device. It may be in a medical device, which is ugly and big and expensive and it has to be plugged into the wall or who knows what, but that's not consumer. So I think that's why I want to see Simband, I want one basically, and I want to customize it to what I need. That's interesting to me. Yeah, so I think I've historically been a kind of a watch guy. I've always worn one, so I'm comfortable with something like Simband being on my wrist. I think there are a couple of other areas. You know, I don't know, because I think in the future there will be interesting things that have certain applications. For example, there's a very sophisticated cycling helmet out, company called LifeBeam. I believe they're Israel-based. They come from you know, military background. You know, think of like fighter pilots wearing helmets, and they're very, you know, motion heavy. They're pulling high G turns and all negative G turns and all these kind of things. And so I know somebody at the office that wears one of these when they cycle, and it gives very good you know, readings about heart rate and motion when you're on a cycle. Apparently, from what I've heard, I haven't used one myself, but every website I go to, they're sold out, which is interesting. So maybe some of the claims they make around motion are true. That whatever extreme sport you're engaged in, we can collect interesting data about your body. So, so I just picked up cycling, which is why I bring this up, and I could see in, you know, a month or two that I'd actually buy this, because now I want to start tracking my performance. But with that said, I don't think there's any single, and I mentioned this on the panel, there's no single body location that is winner take all. Particularly if we think about the world of Internet of Things, right? A lot of people in the Valley here are saying that these, you know, lots of things will have chips in them and collect information about everything. Well, could be my bed, could be my, maybe my TV has some kind of motion detection in it, and it's, you know, I'm interfacing with my TV, you know, Microsoft Xbox already does this kind of thing. Could be any number of devices. I've seen startups that have chips in toothbrushes, you know, so there's, who's to say which one will be a winning form factor. I don't think there's a single one. I think there's many winning form factors.